The dog tags clinked together like wind chimes of the damned, half buried in snow that turned pink with frozen blood. Oberstreiter Klaus Richter knelt down, his breath forming clouds in the bitter December air, and pulled one free from the ice. The metal was so cold it burned his fingers even through his gloves. "Mein Gott," he whispered, reading the stamped letters. "American, 106th Infantry Division." His patrol leader, Feldwebel Otto Kraus, trudged through the knee-deep snow to join him, the MP-40 submachine gun hanging loose at his side. Kraus had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He had seen things that would haunt him until his last breath. But something about this scene made his stomach tighten with a dread he couldn't name. "How many?" Kraus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Richter stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the forest floor ahead. The snow stretched out before them like a vast white canvas, and dotted across it, glinting in the weak winter sunlight, were more tags. Dozens of them, maybe more. They formed a trail that disappeared into the dense pine forest, where shadows gathered like mourners at a mass grave. "I cannot count them all, Feldwebel," Richter said quietly. "They go on as far as I can see." The patrol consisted of 8 men, all of them veterans of the Eastern Front. All of them tired beyond measure. They had been pulled from the fighting around Stalingrad, given 2 weeks of rest that felt like 2 hours, and then thrown into this new offensive in the West. Hitler called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. The men called it desperation. They were supposed to be pushing through weak American lines, racing for the bridges at the Meuse River, splitting the Allied forces in two. Instead, they found themselves in this frozen forest, following a trail of identification tags that told a story none of them wanted to read. "We should report this," said Gefreiter Hans Müller, the youngest of the group at 19. His face was still smooth, unmarked by the war except for the permanent shadow of fear in his eyes. Kraus shook his head. "Report what? That we found some American tags? Command already knows the Americans are here. They want us to find their positions, their strength." He paused, looking at the trail ahead. "This will tell us both." They moved forward in a tactical column, weapons ready, every sense heightened. The forest was too quiet. No bird sang. No small animals rustled in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The trees stood like silent witnesses, their branches heavy with snow, their trunks scarred by shrapnel from the artillery barges that had torn through these woods for days. Every 20 meters, they found more tags. Some were lying flat on the surface of the snow. Others were attached to scraps of uniform, torn and bloody. A few still hung from branches where they had been caught during desperate movement through the forest. Richter collected them mechanically at first, dropping them into his coat pocket, but after the 20th tag, he stopped. There were too many. His pockets couldn't hold them all. What kind of unit loses this many men and keeps moving forward? Müller asked, his voice cracking slightly. "The kind that has nowhere to retreat to," answered Kraus grimly. They had been walking for 30 minutes when they found the first foxhole. It was expertly dug, deep enough to provide good cover, wide enough for 2 men. Empty shell casings littered the bottom. American 30-06 rounds from M1 Garand rifles. Lots of them. Whoever had fought from this position had put up significant resistance before moving on, or before being overrun. But there were no bodies. That was the strange part. No American dead. No wounded left behind. Just the tags, the empty positions, and the brass casings that spoke of fierce fighting. "They are withdrawing," said Richter, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Kraus replied, kneeling beside the foxhole and running his gloved hand along the frozen earth. "Look at the direction, the spacing of the positions. This is not a retreat. This is a fighting withdrawal. They are falling back to better ground, making us pay for every meter." The realization settled over the patrol like a cold fog. Somewhere ahead, in the depths of this frozen forest, an unknown number of American soldiers were preparing another stand, and the German patrol was walking directly toward them, following a trail marked by the identification tags of men who had already fought and died or been captured in this miserable place. The trail led them deeper into the Ardennes, where the forest grew thicker and the shadows longer. Kraus called for a halt near a small frozen stream, its surface covered with ice, so clear they could see the dark water moving sluggishly beneath. The men took the opportunity to rest, though rest was a relative term when the temperature hovered well below freezing, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. Richter sat on a fallen log and pulled out his canteen, but the water inside had frozen solid hours ago. He put away and instead reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of the dog tags he had collected. He studied them in the fading afternoon light, reading the names stamped into the metal. Private First Class Robert Morrison, Sergeant James O'Connor, Corporal David Steinberg. Each tag represented a life, a story, a family somewhere across the ocean that might never know what happened to their son or brother or husband in this godforsaken forest. "You should not think about them as people," said Under-Officer Paul Fisher, settling down beside him. Fisher was older than the others, nearly 40, with a lined face and gray threading through his dark hair. He had been a schoolteacher before the war, and sometimes that gentleness still showed through the hard shell the Eastern Front had built around him. "How else should I think of them?" Richter asked. "As the enemy, it is easier that way." Fisher pulled out a cigarette, one of his last, and lit it carefully, cupping the flame against the wind. "When you start seeing them as people like us, with families and dreams and fears, it becomes harder to do what we must do. Perhaps that is not a bad thing," Richter said quietly. Fisher took a long drag on his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Perhaps, but it will not change what happens next. The Americans are ahead. We will find them. There will be fighting. Some of us will die. Some of them will die. And their dog tags will join the others in the snow." Before Richter could respond, Kraus's sharp whistle cut through the air. The men were on their feet instantly, weapons ready, forming a defensive perimeter. But Kraus was not signaling danger. He was standing at the edge of a small clearing, waving them forward urgently. When they reached him, they understood why. The clearing was perhaps 50 meters across, and it was filled with evidence of a major engagement. Shattered trees bore the scars of artillery fire. Craters pocked the snow-covered ground, and scattered throughout the clearing were more dog tags than they had seen in the entire journey so far. Hundreds of them, forming a carpet of metal and broken chains that caught the light like a field of terrible flowers. "What happened here?" Mueller breathed, his eyes wide with shock. Kraus walked slowly into the clearing, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. In the center, partially covered by fresh snowfall, was a makeshift aid station. Bandages lay scattered and frozen. Medical supplies were strewn about, many of them unused, as if the medics had been forced to abandon their work in a hurry. But again, there were no bodies. The Americans had taken their dead and wounded with them, leaving behind only these metal markers of their presence. "An ambush," Kraus said, his tactical mind reconstructing the battle. "Our forces caught them in the open. Heavy weapons fire, probably mortars and machine guns from multiple positions. The Americans tried to dig in, to hold long enough to evacuate their casualties. Some made it, many did not." Fisher knelt beside one of the craters and pulled something from the frozen earth. It was an American helmet, the distinctive M1 style with a bullet hole punch through the front and a larger exit wound in the back. He turned it over in his hands, noting the faded paint and the dent along one side that had nothing to do with the fatal shot. "This soldier survived other battles," Fisher observed. "This helmet saved his life before, just not this time." They spent 20 minutes searching the clearing, documenting what they found for their report. The evidence suggested that a full company of American infantry, perhaps more, had been caught and decimated here. Yet the survivors had organized well enough to evacuate under fire, maintain some semblance of unit cohesion, and continue their fighting withdrawal deeper into the forest. It spoke to training, discipline, and a determination that even these hardened German veterans had to respect. As the sun began its early winter descent toward the horizon, Kraus made a decision. "We continue for one more hour. Then we find a defensive position for the night and report what we have found." They moved out of the clearing, following the trail once more. The dog tags became less frequent now, as if the Americans had learned to police their dead more carefully, or perhaps because there were simply fewer men left to lose them. The forest pressed in on all sides, creating natural corridors that would be perfect for ambushes. Every man in the patrol felt the weight of unseen eyes, the prickle of crosshairs settling on the back of their necks. 30 minutes later, they found the village, or what was left of it, a tiny Belgian hamlet, no more than a dozen buildings clustered around a small church with a stone bell tower. The Germans approached cautiously, using the tree line for cover, observing before committing to enter. Smoke rose from several of the buildings, thin gray columns that spoke of fires burning low, almost out. The church itself appeared intact, its heavy wooden doors closed against the winter cold. Americans, Mueller whispered. Kraus studied the village through his binoculars, scanning for movement, for any sign of occupation. The snow in the village square was heavily disturbed, marked by the passage of many boots and the distinctive tread patterns of American vehicles. But he saw no sentries, no defensive positions, no movement at all. If they were here, they have moved on, he said finally. But recently, very recently, we will search the buildings, but carefully. Mueller, you and Schmidt check the houses on the left. Fischer and Hoffman, take the right. Richter, with me, we will check the church. The village square was a tableau of recent chaos frozen in time. Kraus and Richter moved forward in tactical bounds, covering each other as they advanced toward the church. Their boots crunched on snow that had been trampled by hundreds of feet, and beneath the fresh powder, they could see darker stains that told stories no one needed to speak aloud. Abandoned equipment lay scattered like the possessions of refugees fleeing a flood. A broken rifle here, a shredded backpack there, a single boot standing upright in a drift as if its owner had simply evaporated. The church doors were massive oak, reinforced with iron bands that had been forged centuries before this war began. Kraus tested the handle slowly, his MP-40 ready, while Richter covered him from an angle. The door swung open with a groan that seemed obscenely loud in the silence, and they entered the dimness within. The interior of the church was warmer than outside, heated by the residual warmth of bodies that had sheltered here. The pews had been pushed aside to create space, and the stone floor was covered with evidence of an American field hospital. Blood-stained bandages lay in piles. Empty plasma bottles hung from makeshift stands. The air still carried the copper smell of blood, mixed with the antiseptic odor of medical alcohol. And everywhere, on every available surface, were more dog tags. But these were different. These had been carefully arranged, laid out in neat rows on the altar itself, organized with precision that spoke of respect and remembrance. Hundreds of them, each representing a soldier who had died in this village or in the forest beyond. Someone had taken the time, even in the midst of battle and retreat, to collect these tags and arrange them like offerings in this sacred space. Richter walked slowly toward the altar, his weapon lowered now, drawn by the solemn display. As he got closer, he saw that beneath each row of tags was a piece of paper with names written in careful script, organized by unit and rank. This was not the hasty collection of a retreating army. This was a memorial, created by men who knew they might not survive to deliver these tags to the families who waited for news across the Atlantic. They honored their dead, Richter said softly, even here, even knowing they might die themselves. Kraus joined him at the altar, his weathered face unreadable in the dim light, filtering through the stained glass windows. He reached out and touched one of the tags, then pulled his hand back as it burned. The 106th Infantry Division, Kraus read from the papers beneath the tags. The Golden Lions. They arrived in Europe only weeks ago. Most of these men had never seen combat before this battle. He paused, his jaw tightening. And now this... A sound from the back of the church made both men spin, weapons raised. But it was only Fischer, emerging for what appeared to be the pastor's residence attached to the church. "You need to see this," Fischer said, his voice strange, tight with emotion Kraus could not immediately identify. They followed him through a narrow doorway into a small room that had served as the church office. A desk stood against one wall, and on it lay an American medical journal, left open to a page where someone had been writing. Kraus picked it up carefully and read the neat handwriting. December 19th, 1944. "We have lost contact with division headquarters. Captain Morrison is dead. Lieutenant Chun is dead. I am the ranking medical officer for what remains of 3 companies. We have approximately 200 wounded, 50 critical. Morphine nearly gone. Plasma gone. We cannot stay here. The Germans are closing in from 3 sides. We will attempt to move the wounded to American lines, but I do not know where those lines are anymore. To whoever finds this, we did our duty. We tried to save them all. God forgive us for those we could not save. The entry was signed by Captain Richard Holloway, Medical Corps, 106th Infantry Division. Krause set the journal down carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. He looked at Fisher, then at Richter, and saw on their faces the same troubling mixture of respect and dread that he felt in his own chest. 200 wounded, Fisher said quietly, moving through this forest, in this weather, with us hunting them. Orders are orders, Krause replied, but his voice lacked conviction. We are to locate and report enemy positions. And if we find them, Richter asked, if we find 200 wounded men, and whoever is left to defend them? The question hung in the cold air of the church office, unanswered because they all knew the answer. Orders were orders. The war did not stop for compassion, or respect, or the acknowledgement of shared humanity. The war ground forward, consuming everything in its path, turning men into statistics and dog tags into memorial displays in abandoned churches. Outside, the rest of the patrol had gathered in the square. Mueller had found an American Jeep, disabled but otherwise intact, filled with supplies that the retreating Americans had not been able to carry. Schmidt discovered a foxhole network at the village perimeter, well constructed and recently abandoned, that spoke to professional soldiering and determined defense. Each piece of evidence added to the growing picture an American unit that had been shattered but not broken, decimated but still fighting, retreating but doing so in good order and with honor. As the winter sun touched the horizon, painting the snow in shades of orange and red that reminded them all too much of blood and fire, Krause gathered his patrol in the church. They stood in a circle beneath the vaulted ceiling, surrounded by the dog tags of dead men, and Krause made his report via radio to battalion headquarters. Patrol, Krause reporting. We have followed American withdrawal route through the forest. Evidence suggests elements of the 106th Infantry Division. Strength unknown, but significant. Moving west with wounded. Trail leads deeper into the Ardennes. Request instructions. The radio crackle was static for a long moment before the reply came. Distorted but clear enough. Continue pursuit. Locate and fix enemy position. Air support will be available at dawn. Do not engage unless necessary. Confirm receipt. Confirmed, Krause replied, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. He switched off the radio and looked at his men. We rest here tonight. 2-hour watches. No fires. We move at first light. As darkness fell over the Belgian village, the German patrol settled into the church for the night, sleeping among the memorials of the men they were hunting. Outside, the temperature dropped further, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of more snow and the distant sound that might have been artillery or might have been thunder. In the darkness, Richter lay awake, feeling the weight of the dog tags in his pocket, thinking about the American doctor who had written that desperate journal entry, wondering if he was still alive out there in the frozen forest, still trying to save his wounded, still believing that duty and honor meant something in a world that seemed determined to prove otherwise. Somewhere in the night, a wolf howled, and the sound was answered by another, and then another, until the forest echoed with their cries. The wolves were hunting too, drawn by the scent of blood and death that hung over the Ardennes like a shroud. And in the morning, the hunt would continue, men pursuing men to the snow, following a trail of dog tags and blood toward an ending that none of them could see, but all of them could feel approaching like a winter storm. Dawn came reluctantly to the Ardennes, as if the sun itself was hesitant to illuminate what the day would bring. Krause's patrol moved out of the village in the gray pre-dawn light, following the trail that led west through increasingly difficult terrain. The snow had fallen heavily during the night, covering some of the tracks, but not all of them. The Americans were moving in a column now, their trail concentrated and easier to follow. They were tired. Krause knew tired men made mistakes. They stopped disciplining their march. They left more signs of their passage. The forest opened into a valley after 2 hours of hard walking, and what Krause saw there made him raise his fist for an immediate halt. His patrol dropped into cover positions among the trees, and every man stared at the scene below with a mixture of awe and disbelief. In the valley, arranged in a defensive perimeter around a frozen stream, were the Americans, not just a company, not just a battalion. It looked like the remnants of an entire regiment, perhaps 1,500 men, maybe more. They had dug in during the night, creating an impressive network of foxholes and fighting positions that used the natural terrain to maximum advantage. In the center of the perimeter, protected by the outer defenses, Krause could see the wounded lying in makeshift shelters constructed from parachutes and whatever materials the soldiers could scavenge. Mein Gott, Mueller whispered. There are so many. Krause studied the position through his binoculars, his tactical mind automatically analyzing fields of fire, approaches, weaknesses. But what struck him most was not the defensive capability, impressive as it was the organization. These men had been fighting and retreating for days. They had lost their commanding officers, their supply lines, their connection to higher headquarters. By all rights, they should have scattered, broken into small groups trying to infiltrate back to American lines individually. Instead, they had consolidated, maintained unit cohesion, and prepared to make another stand. What are they doing? Richter asked, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. They cannot hold here. They must know we will bring artillery, air support. They should keep moving. Fisher, lying prone beside a fallen log with his rifle trained on the valley, spoke without taking his eye from the sight. They are buying time. Look at the wounded. There are too many to move quickly. So they stop here, they fight here, they hold here as long as they can so that some of them might escape. Krause lowered his binoculars and made his decision. Fisher, you and Hoffman circle north and find a position where you can observe their northern approaches. Mueller, Schmidt, do the same to the south. Richter, with me, we report this and wait for orders. As the patrol split up to complete their reconnaissance, Krause and Richter moved to higher ground where they could establish radio contact. The message Krause sent was brief and professional, giving coordinates, estimated enemy strength, defensive positions, and a tactical assessment. The reply came quickly. Air support was being diverted. Artillery batteries were calculating firing solutions. A full infantry battalion was being redirected to their position. The Americans in the valley below had perhaps 3 hours before the hammer fell. We should pull back, Richter said as Krause finished the transmission. If they have scouts out, if they detect us, we are only 8 men against 1,500. We stay, Krause replied. Our job is to keep eyes on them, to report if they move. He paused, looking down at the valley where American soldiers were moving between positions, distributing ammunition, checking weapons, doing all the small tasks that soldiers do when they know battle is coming. Besides, I want to see how this ends. The hours that followed were among the strangest of Krause's war. He lay in the snow on a hillside overlooking the valley, watching an enemy that did not know it was being watched. Seeing them prepare for a battle they could not win. He saw medical personnel moving among the wounded with a tenderness that transcended nationality. He saw soldiers sharing their rations with men too injured to feed themselves. He saw an officer, probably the ranking survivor, moving from position to position, checking on his men, offering words of encouragement that Krause could not hear but could recognize in the gestures and the responses. At one point, a group of soldiers in the center of the perimeter gathered in a circle. Even from a distance, Krause could see that some of them were praying, their heads bowed, their hands clasped. A chaplain moved among them, and though Krause could not hear the words, he knew what was being said. The same things chaplains of every army said before battle, that their cause was just, that God was with them. That courage in the face of death was the highest virtue a soldier could possess. They are brave men, Richter said quietly, voicing what Krause was thinking. It seems wrong, what we are about to do. War is wrong, Krause replied. This is just one more wrong thing in a long list of wrong things. But it is what we are ordered to do. At 1000 hours, the first artillery shells began to fall. They came screaming out of the gray sky like the voices of demons, impacting the valley with thunderous explosions that sent geysers of snow, earth, and debris high into the air. The American positions disappeared in a fog of smoke and destruction as German gunners walked their fire across the perimeter with methodical precision. Through his binoculars, Krause watched the Americans respond. They did not break. They did not panic. They pulled their wounded deeper into cover and returned fire at targets they could not see, their rifles and machine guns barking defiance at an enemy that was killing them from miles away. When the artillery lifted after 15 minutes, leaving the valley scarred and smoking, the Americans were still there, still organized, still fighting. Then came the aircraft. 3 Messerschmitt fighters screamed over the valley at low altitude, their cannons and machine guns raking the American positions. The sound was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder, explosions and gunfire that seemed to go on forever but lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When they pulled away, climbing back into the overcast sky, parts of the American perimeter were simply gone, obliterated by the concentrated firepower. But still, incredibly, the Americans fought on. Krauss could see officers rallying their men, reorganizing the defense, moving soldiers from destroyed positions to reinforce those still intact. It was magnificent and terrible in equal measure, a display of courage and determination that any soldier, regardless of which flag they served under, had to respect. The German infantry battalion arrived at 1100 hours, moving into assault positions on 3 sides of the valley. Krauss's patrol was ordered to pull back as the attack began. From their withdrawal route, they could hear the sound of battle intensifying, rifle fire, machine guns, grenades, and the screams of men dying in the snow. It went on for 2 hours, and when it finally ended, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Later, after they had returned to German lines and made their full report, Krauss learned what had happened. The Americans had held until their ammunition was exhausted. Then they had fixed bayonets for a final stand that never came, because they had simply run out of men to mount it. Nearly 400 Americans were captured in that valley, most of them wounded. The rest had died fighting or had somehow escaped in the confusion of battle, disappearing into forest to continue their journey west. That night, in a bunker behind the lines, Krauss sat with a patrol and listened to the radio broadcasts. The German announcer spoke of a great victory, of American forces destroyed, a defensive pushing forward according to plan. They did not mention the dog tags. They did not mention the memorial in the church or the medical journal or the desperate courage of men who had fought against impossible odds for no better reason than that it was their duty to fight. Richter pulled the handful of dog tags from his pocket and laid them on the rough wooden table between them. They sat in silence, looking at those bits of stamped metal, thinking about the men whose names they bore and about the families who would eventually receive them with a telegram expressing the nation's gratitude for their sacrifice. "What do we do with these?" Richter asked finally. Krauss picked up one of the tags and read the name. Private First Class Robert Morrison. The first one they had found, what seemed like a lifetime ago, but was only yesterday. He thought about everything they had seen, everything they had learned about the men they had hunted through the snow. "We keep them," Krauss said quietly. "We remember, when this war is over, if we survive it, we find a way to return them. It is the least we can do." The patrol nodded in agreement, and each man took a few of the tags, tucking them away in pockets and pouches where they would remain throughout the rest of the war. Some of those men would not survive to fulfill that promise. Mueller would die at Bastogne 3 weeks later. Hoffman would fall during the Rhine crossing. But others would live, and years after the war ended, some of those dog tags would find their way home, carried by former enemies who had learned in a frozen Belgian forest that courage and honor were not the exclusive property of any one flag or nation. Outside the bunker, the war continued. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, consuming tens of thousands of lives on both sides before the German offensive finally collapsed from exhaustion and Allied counterattacks. But in that moment, in that bunker, 8 German soldiers sat in silence and remembered the men they had hunted, the men who had left a trail of dog tags in the snow, the men who had taught them that even in the midst of humanity's darkest hour, the light of the human spirit could still shine through.